Okay, hi, my name is Dr. Matthew Wall. I'm an associate professor in politics here at Swansea University, and I wanted to just give you guys a little taster lecture, kind of give you a sense of some of the topics we'd cover if you're studying your degree here in politics at Swansea. So the topic that I've chosen for today's lecture is one of kind of contemporary relevance. I'm interested in trying to understand the political consequences of the Dominic Cummings scandal. And what I want to use this to illustrate, I suppose, is the difference between what I call like barstool politics, okay, which presumably if you're interested in studying politics, you're interested in politics. But how do we move beyond the kind of discussions that somebody who's never studied politics in their life might have at the bar, on the bar stool, into a more sort of sophisticated analysis? Now, this is a real difficulty when we study politics. Why is it difficult? Well, in the first place, politics is inherently complex and inherently human, right? So every day there are thousands of political stories that take place, each of which has multiple interpretations, ways of making sense of it. And oftentimes we don't really get beyond like what are essentially instinctive reactions. Now, the problem is that those instinctive reactions are often reflections of our pre-existing opinions, beliefs, values, or biases. So how do we get beyond these barstool opinions? Well, in this sort of systematic study of politics, we develop concepts and theories that allow us to understand and interpret events. Okay, so we build up a vocabulary of ideas that are based in theories that let us kind of move beyond this instinctive gut reaction. And we hold ourselves to standards of evidence that are objective, right? So not just what we think, but we look at evidence, and in this case I'm going to look at survey evidence that comes from outside of ourselves. And then finally we develop analyses that weave together these elements, okay? And ultimately having a degree in politics allows you to follow this process. And that's how you get beyond barstool politics. Now, my example is the Dominic Cummings scandal and its political implications. Now, for those of you, hopefully you're following politics enough to know what I'm talking about in very brief terms. Dominic Cummings is a key advisor to the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. It was reported in mid-May that he'd, during the lockdown, that he'd travelled with his family to Durham from their home in London to his parents, to an adjoining property on his parents' estate, in order to have access to childcare. While there, one of the stories was that he'd driven to Barnard Castle in order to test his eyesight and capacity to drive for the longer trip back to London. And so this story kind of broke gradually and resulted in the image that you'll see on the slide here. An amazing image really of a political advisor giving a press conference in the Rose Garden of Downing Street, a venue normally reserved for high-level politicians, for major political events. So this was a really important scandal. Okay, so the problem, I suppose, this illustrates some of the problems I talked about earlier, right? This is a complex story, and you can view it through a wide range of lenses. However, for our purposes, let's just talk about two that you might have come across when you talked about this with friends or family. So one lens is that this is an instance of hypocrisy, right? That there was one rule for the elite and another rule for the population. That the kind of exceptional circumstances that Dominic Cummings talked about wasn't that exceptional at all, that a lot of people had similar problems and had stayed at home, as the government advice was at the time. And as a corollary of this, that this would somehow weaken the efficacy of the entire lockdown regime, right? That people would think, well, if Dominic Cummings could do it, why can't I, right? And so this would be obviously a very damaging narrative for the government. An alternative, sort of more sympathetic narrative is, well, this is just one father. This is a family man trying to make the best decisions possible for his family and to kind of stick as closely as possible to the guidelines. And that actually, you know, the fact that he was being targeted is really a sign of just how leftist and how anti-government the media is, right? And people on this side might look at similar instances of other politicians who didn't get nearly as much attention. Okay, so in your sort of barstool politics, you could view this either way, and we'd struggle really to move on, right? So just pick your side and have at it. Now, in a more political science way of looking at it, we start off with these kind of theories and concepts, and we try and weave them together into an argument and evaluate them against evidence. So my way of looking at this is, whatever the rights and wrongs of it, ultimately it did manage to damage the government, and it did so primarily because it broke through what I call three bubbles that normally protect a government in a circumstance like this. Okay, now the first bubble, is this notion of rally around the flag. This is commonly a common finding in political science, that when a nation is beset by a substantial crisis, there's a tendency to get behind whatever the leadership of that nation is, right? Simply as a kind of a reaction to the crisis, right? So this was really seen very prominently in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States of America, when George W. Bush's approval ratings went through the roof, right? People want to get behind the leader in a time of crisis. It's a very common psychological necessity for group survival. Okay, so that's one that's one kind of theoretically informed concept that could have protected the government from this hurting them. A second is the idea that this is a Westminster bubble story, right? Another bubble. That by and large, the idea here is that most people don't really care about news that's kind of about inside baseball, about the activities of people like advisors and politicians. That this is a story that is fascinating to the media, who are part of this Westminster bubble, but not likely to cut through to the public. And then thirdly, we have a well-established idea that there's what's called a perceptive filtering that happens, that by and large, people have sort of picked their sides in politics, that they have like what are called partisan identifications. And in recent politics in the UK, that's been strengthened by this Brexit divide. And so the implication here would be that, well, what you're going to see is people who support Boris Johnson and the Conservatives will discount this and say that it's not important, and people who support Labour or are against Brexit will see it as very important, and so nothing really will change. Okay, so those are three sort of sets of ideas. Now, what I'm going to say is that the evidence says that actually this story seems to have popped all three of these bubbles in a way that could be damaging to the government. Okay, so if we look at this rally around the flag idea, well, the problem here is that when this story broke, the rally around the flag had already started to decline pretty precipitously, right? So if you look at the sort of early days of this crisis really starting to impact on the public imagination, so kind of mid to late March, we see that the approval rating for the government, so the percentage of people saying they approve strongly or somewhat of the government performance, was up above 70%. Now, by the time this happens, so as we get just before it to May 22nd, that had already declined down to 45%, and it continued to slide to around 41%. Okay, so the rally around the flag effect had already started to fizzle out, possibly due to dissatisfaction. You know, like the international tables of deaths don't make for very good reading for the UK. Boris Johnson's communication around this point hadn't been very clear as they tried to transition out of the lockdown into a kind of a gradual transition, and so this effect didn't really provide much protection for Dominic Cummings, and so we can see a 5 or 6 point slip here. In terms of cutting through, the Westminster bubble effect doesn't seem to have been there. This was such a pervasive story that only 4% of respondents in an opinion survey hadn't heard of it at all, because 96% of people had heard about this story. So to cut through the Westminster bubble. And the partisan filtering is a little bit more mixed in terms of evidence. So we can see that here, that of all UK adults, 66% indicated that Dominic Cummings should be sacked, and that this was most strongly felt among Labour voters in 2019, 86%. Now, this was somewhat offset by people who voted Conservative, but of them still, 48% felt that Cummings should have been sacked. So the partisan selective effects idea was there, but not really strongly enough to offset this. So that leads to my overall argumentation that, yes, this story has damaged the government by breaking through the normal protective filters that allow governments to more or less continue to be popular in spite of negative stories. Now, the last thing I'd say is that what you really want to get a sense of is also knowing what you don't know. I think that's as important as being able to coherent analysis is to kind of recognize the limits of our insight, right? And the big question is, will this continue to matter? Certainly in the short term, we've seen a tightening of polls, right? This has damaged the performance of the Conservative Party at the polls, but will it last? And that's a question that is very difficult to answer. We don't have in political science a lot of understanding of why some stories that damage the government damage it only in the short term and they recover, and why some other stories tend to leave lasting damage. So we've seen, for example, Black Wednesday back in 1992 with the Conservative Party, the financial crisis for Labour. Those were long-term damaging stories. This one has the potential to be, but we just don't have the evidence yet. And what we'll just have to wait and see is whether this slump in the perceptions of the Conservative Party sustains or goes away with time. And that not knowing, I suppose, is part of what makes studying politics so interesting. So I hope you found this taster lecture enjoyable, and that you come to study here at Swansea. So thank you very much.